Hello and welcome everybody to New Hampshire Peace Action's Peace and Justice Conversation Series online. I'm Will Hopkins. I'm the director of New Hampshire Peace Action. And if you're new to NHPA, we educate, mobilize, and organize to build a more peaceful and just future for all. We envisage a future where international relations are based on cooperation instead of competition and conflict, and where mutual benefit and shared security lead to a more peaceful and just global community. The corona pandemic spurred us to start this bi-weekly conversation series 2.5 years ago as part of a way for us to continue our public education work. And we found it so effective that we've decided to continue on indefinitely. This every other Monday online conversation series is intended for us to engage and sort out how to make the changes we've been yearning for. In that spirit of understanding and respect, we'd like to acknowledge that we're doing our work here in New Hampshire on the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We want to honor with gratitude the land and waterways that they have been stewarding throughout the generations. So tonight, we are bringing you Lindsay Koshgarian, who is the executive director of the National Priorities Project, which tracks national federal spending. Lindsay has been there for at least a decade now, right?
About 8 years, actually.
8 years, okay.
Not quite yet.
Yeah, but I've come to depend on National Priorities Project to help me break down the budget, and their trade-offs on the website are one of the most useful tools we have to explain exactly what the financial costs to our communities are to the levels of military spending that our federal electeds insist we need. I don't want to get too bogged down in introductions because I'm really excited to hear from you, Lindsay. So why don't you take it away?
Thanks, Will. And thanks to Will and Amy for inviting me here tonight. And thanks to all of you for being here. I know I'm looking at a group tonight of really dedicated activists, and that's always my favorite type of group to talk to. So I know you're all probably going to have questions that'll be able to challenge me and know a lot about these things. So I expect to have a really fun conversation tonight. I'm going to start with I have some slides I'm going to share and start talking about the Pentagon budget and specifically where we are right now in the federal budget process and what we need to be looking out for. Will already spoke a little bit about National Priorities Project, which I run, which is part of the Institute for Policy Studies, progressive think tank. And National Priorities Project has been around for about 35 years now. And since our founding in 1983, we've been focused on shifting money from the military budget into human needs. And way back in 1983, that was because Ronald Reagan, president at the time, had shifted funds. And we find ourselves in a not dissimilar place today. So that is our mission, that is our reason for being, and that's what I'm here to talk with you tonight about. So I'm going to share some slides that I have. So right now, our Pentagon budget is $782 billion this year, and that includes the Department of Defense, it includes nuclear weapons, and it includes a few other odds and ends, things like the CIA. Some of the FBI's budget is actually considered national security, which is what this budget is. But we are just hurtling quickly toward $1 trillion figure for that budget. Now, some of you have probably heard $1 trillion figure anyway when you include other things like Homeland Security and veterans, and it quickly does get over $1 trillion. But we're hurtling toward $1 trillion for just the Department of Defense and nuclear weapons at the rate we're going now. So I'm going to talk some about where we are, how we've gotten here, and where we're going in the next couple of months and what we can be doing about it. So first of all, I want to note that it feels like a long time ago now, But it was just last year that the United States finally pulled our last troops out of Afghanistan. It was just over a year ago. And after ending that 20-year war that also cost over $8 trillion, we managed as a country to save not one single penny in Pentagon spending since then. It is the first time on record that the United States has ended a war and didn't cut military spending at all. It is the first time after all of our wars, after World War I, after World War II, after the Vietnam War, after the Korean War, after every other war, after the first Gulf War, every other war, spending has spiked for the war, and then it has come back down. And this is the first time that it didn't come back down at all. So we're at a really historically high level of military spending right now. And it's a difficult environment to get the cuts that we would want to see. Now, this is a picture. This is our famous pie chart. If you've ever seen National Priorities Project work, this is probably the thing you've seen. This shows where spending in the annual federal discretionary budget goes. This is the budget that Congress passes each year. When you hear about Congress trying to pass a budget, when you hear about budget negotiations, when you hear about government shutdowns, this is where all of that is concerned. And as you can see, President Biden's budget proposal for fiscal year 2023, which began on October 1st, of just a few weeks ago of this year, his proposal was that 52% of the discretionary budget for this fiscal year would go to the military. That is just typical. That's where the United States, that's where the budget has been for a long time. And it is unfortunately where President Biden, what his vision showed for where he thought the federal budget should be again this year, more than half of the budget going to the military. And you can see all of the other things combined are smaller than that. That includes veterans benefits, it includes affordable housing, it includes public education, it includes law enforcement, it includes public health, like the CDC. So really critical functions that are all forced into less than half of the federal discretionary budget. I'm just going to show a little variation on that. So 52% of Biden's budget request went to the military. And that's just a request. This isn't what's been enacted. Congress is still working on that. But when you look at security, what they call security, which includes the military, but also Department of Homeland Security, Veterans Affairs, except veterans medical care, nuclear weapons, intelligence, that accounts for 59% of what he asked for. So that means, and then veterans medical care is another 8%. That means there's only 1 out of every 3 federal dollars that's available for what they call non-security, which includes everything else. It includes housing, public health, public education, community investments, the CDC, the NIH, all of those agencies that work to keep us healthy, work to keep us housed, work to provide public education for our children. All of those have to fit in 1 out of 3 federal dollars. So you can see that it's really, the Pentagon budget is, first of all, it's causing us to engage in conflicts in a lot of places, but it's also really squeezing our investments here at home. So here are some examples of what else was in the Biden budget. He asked for 3 times as much for nuclear weapons as for the CDC, even as we're still not out of the COVID-19 pandemic. 3 times more for nuclear weapons than for the Centers for Disease Control. He asked for 9 times as much for nuclear modernization as for anti-homelessness grants at a time when, you remember during the pandemic, there were all these eviction moratoriums, there were all sorts of protections so that renters wouldn't lose their homes. Those are all ending now, or ended. But we have less for helping people who are in homelessness by a lot than we have for building up a nuclear weapons system to reinvest in nuclear weapons in the 21st century, which is not something that I think that a lot of us would have hoped we would be hearing as the 20th century came to an end. We would have hoped that would have gone in a very different direction. Biden asked for 20 times as much for military research and development as for renewable energy and energy efficiency. Now that one's highlighted. It has since changed since the Inflation Reduction Act passed. But even so, the annual spending for climate in the Inflation Reduction Act is $37 billion. So it's still far less than the annual investment in military research and development. $37 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act for climate compared to $130 billion every year for military R&D. Biden asked for twice as much for the Space Force, which was Trump's invention, as for substance abuse and mental health, even though we have an opioid epidemic that is continuing on and continuing to take lives every year. And he asked for more for a single weapons system, the F-35 jet fighter, than for all diplomacy, which was only $9.6 billion. So we have a problem. we have a problem when, and this is a Democratic administration, and these numbers looked much worse when a couple of years ago when I was looking at Trump requests. But these are the Biden request numbers. So we really have a problem in priorities in this country. So how does this get decided? Those are the Biden requests. That's just a request. Congress, as you all probably know, are the ones who actually decide where the money goes. And there are two major avenues, two major parts of that budget process that Congress does that decide what the military budget ultimately will be. One is the appropriations process. And right now, what's supposed to happen is Congress is supposed to pass 12 separate appropriations bills. Those are spending bills for a variety of different areas that cover all the different things that the government does. It's supposed to pass them before the October 1st, beginning of the fiscal year. That didn't happen. What they did was they set the federal government on autopilot. So it's still running at last year's spending levels until they pass new appropriations, which they will probably do in the form of what's called an omnibus, which is one giant bill to fund everything the government does. And the reason that matters is because when they do it that way, it forces a lot more negotiation and give and take between different parts of federal spending. And in practice, what that means is that folks in Congress on the left typically acquiesce to higher Pentagon spending so that they can get a little more domestic spending. And so the omnibus bill really makes it difficult for us to even have folks in Congress who are on the left stand up against higher Pentagon spending. So that's the appropriations part of the process. And then there's also the authorization part of the process. And that's a bill that Congress has passed every year. It is a military policy bill. So it's a lot more than just spending, but it also includes military spending, which is the National Defense Authorization Act. Now, both of these things are kind of halted in Congress right now while they focus on the midterm elections. We don't expect anything more to happen on either one of them until after the elections are over, but that is coming up pretty soon now. So sometime in November, they'll start to seriously look at these things again. And of course, we don't know what the outcome of the election will be, but whatever it is, if the House or the Senate or both were to change hands, that doesn't come, of course, until January. So there's a little window of time where Congress needs to take care of the appropriations and the National Defense Authorization Act from right after the elections in November until the end of the year is when that's most likely to happen. And so this also means this is a time for folks to call into your members of Congress, let them know what you want, get other people to call in, all of those good things. And just to sort of review where the House and the Senate are in general on this, Both the House and the Senate this year added money. President Biden requested just over an $800 billion military budget this year, which was bad enough. The House and the Senate have each added significantly in their versions of those bills to date. The House added $37 billion and the Senate added $45 billion to the figure that Biden requested. So we're looking at numbers that get up when you look at some of these numbers, we're looking at numbers that get up pretty much all the way to an $850 billion military budget. That is what they're considering now. So what do we need to be watching for in the next couple of months as they go through these two processes, the appropriations process and the National Defense Authorization Act? One is that top line, that big number. Are they sticking? Is there any chance they go back closer to Biden's 800, closer to 800 figure, or do they end up at one of these higher numbers, closer to 850 billion, or do they go even higher? Because I'll talk about there are plenty of folks in Congress who would like to see that number continue to reach even higher. So one of the things to watch is where this finally ends up. And there are both folks in Congress who want to see this number go higher, and there are folks in Congress who are still working, who are still asking to have that number at least knocked back to where the Biden request was, at least knocked back to 800 billion. And so, for example, Senators Warren and Markey in Massachusetts, who are my senators, and Senator Bernie Sanders in Vermont have introduced an amendment in the Senate that would knock out the Senate increase and go back at least to just what President Biden requested, to the 803 billion that he asked for. So there are sort of reasons to try to act on that. Another thing to look for, there were actually a few promising things in the Biden budget request that are still hanging on and still have a hope. One of them is funding for the F-35 jet fighter. So folks may know this is the Pentagon's most expensive weapons system. It's supposed to be a 5th generation jet fighter. It has had all kinds of problems. It has spontaneously caught fire at least 3 times. The helmet alone for an F-35 costs $400,000. That's still more than a college education at most colleges today. So it's just it's an outrage, and this is something that Senator John McCain, who was a big fan of the military, called a scandal and a tragedy. So the F-35 is not a good program. It's not something where we should be putting, as I mentioned earlier, more money than we put into diplomacy. But the Pentagon and the Biden request cut the number of new F-35s that they wanted to purchase by 1/3 this year compared to where it had been. And that's an acknowledgement that the program is sucking up too much money. And that is something that still has a chance right now in the versions of the bills that are in the House and Senate. So that's one area where we can potentially get at least a small win. Another is something called the Sea-Launched Cruise Missile Nuclear, which, as it sounds like, is a nuclear weapons system. And the reason it's such a bad idea is that the platform that it launches from can launch both conventional and nuclear weapons. And the reason that that's bad is because an adversary who sees this platform and sees a weapon launching won't know until if it's a nuclear weapon or a conventional weapon until it's too late. And they may decide to counter attack with a nuclear weapon if they fear that that's what that is. So this is something that could accidentally start a nuclear war. It is therefore not a weapon system we want to see continue to be funded. And it is something that the Biden administration defunded in their budget proposal. Of course, there are folks in Congress who are already fighting to get it back. But the White House just about a week ago, again, reiterated that they don't want to see funding for this program. So this is another thing where we have a chance for a small win. Another one that the Biden proposal also defunded is the B-83 gravity bomb, which is also a nuclear weapon, and which is a much larger nuclear weapon than most of what's in the current arsenal. This is something that was actually defunded previously under Obama, and then Trump brought back the program, and the Biden administration wants to kill it again. And again, folks in Congress are fighting to keep this program around. But this is something where, again, the White House reiterated just a week or so ago that they want to make sure this program doesn't come back. So this is another thing where we have a chance to possibly win something. And then the final thing is Ukraine aid. And the pessimist in me says that some amount of Ukraine aid in this bill is inevitable. But there are some things about it that we still need to watch out for. There are some versions of it that would basically just be writing a blank check to the Pentagon, and it wouldn't have to be used for Ukraine even. So things like that we need to keep on the lookout for. So these are kind of my top 5 of what to be watching for as these things go forward in the next couple of months. Now, that said, there can always be surprises, and we may well learn about something terrible that is in a new amendment as this moves forward, or something that happens behind closed doors in a negotiation that we need to pay attention to. But at this moment, these are the things that I'm keeping an eye on as this goes forward over the next couple of months. Now, here are the arguments about what we're hearing about why they just want more money. And this is, certainly a lot of it's coming from Republicans, but there are a lot of Democrats who are in on the game too in Congress. And one of the top things we're hearing about is inflation. Of course, this is a big issue in the election. It's a big issue in the country right now. It's a big issue for a lot of people's lives. But it's actually not such an issue for the Pentagon. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why inflation is not a good reason to give the Pentagon even 1 penny more. Another is China, and this is the one that you hear a lot about, especially from members of Congress and inside DC, is the need to counter China. Russia, of course, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine is something we're hearing about. And then jobs is not something that's talked about as much, but we all know it's there. It's sort of the elephant in the room for a lot of members of Congress, and a reason why they always want to see a higher military budget. So on inflation, we have this great study from the Costs of War Project at Brown University, and an economist there, Heidi Peltier, wrote that rising inflation should not be a reason to increase the DoD budget, because the DoD doesn't experience inflation the same as the rest of the economy. If you just imagine, they're buying completely different things from most of us, and they just don't see the same rates of inflation. So we at least need to look at what their actual rates of inflation are. Now, the evidence that we've seen so far is that contractors who take about half of the military budget every year are not seeing their profits decrease at all. There's no sign that that is happening. And so that itself is a strong argument against giving more money to the Pentagon to deal with inflation. And this is just another example if we needed to be a little more skeptical about, especially about the fact that any inflationary increase for the Pentagon will go to contractors. We know that over the 20 years after 9/11, 20 years of the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, the security state took $21 trillion in our tax dollars, and a third of that, $7 trillion, was for military contracts. It's a huge amount of money. They're making huge profits, and we need to look at them much more closely before we just hand over more money. We also know that they used taxpayer money. Pentagon contractors used taxpayer money that was meant to buy COVID pandemic supplies, and used it instead to make jet parts and body armor for their own use. Now on Russia, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is, of course, a huge problem, but more US military spending is not part of the answer. So here on this chart, you can just see US military spending and then military spending by the rest of NATO in 2021 compared to Russian military spending. And when you compare the US versus Russia, we spend 12 times as much as they do. When you compare the US plus the rest of NATO to Russia, it's 18 times as much. So there's no comparison, and adding more dollars to these military budgets is not going, if it was going to dissuade Russia, it would have dissuaded Russia already. That is not a legitimate argument. And in fact, most of the military budget that they're talking about hasn't included military aid for Ukraine. Most of that has been on top of the regular military budget. So that's really just a red herring, and is not an argument that has any bearing on what the US military budget should be. And finally, China. This is one we hear so much about. And for one thing, there's no way in which China threatens the US or the world where more US military spending is going to help solve a problem. The threat that China poses to the US is entirely economic, and it is not something that we can solve through military spending. The one thing that you do hear about is whatever role the US might play in the event that China would show aggression towards Taiwan, which I'm not a China or Taiwan expert. But what the experts say about this is that, first of all, the likelihood of China taking any action like that against Taiwan is very low. And second of all, the consequences of the US getting directly involved in anything like that would be unimaginable. China is a nuclear-armed state. That is not something, very much like the US role in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it is not something where the US would be able to just jump into that militarily. Another set of reasons has to do with something different, which is the fact that China is not at war with any country or ally, and certainly not the United States. And all of this military buildup that we're engaged in is having the effect of making the US relationship with China much, much more fraught and dangerous. And the two biggest emitters of fossil fuel emissions in the world today are the United States and China. If we are going to solve climate change, those two countries have to be at the table. There is no solution to climate change without both of us being active participants in that. And the more we make our relationships worse with China, the more difficult that solution becomes. And so the headline I have on the screen right now is "Progressive Groups Warn of Risk to Climate from US Confrontational Approach to China." This is a letter that we led together with some climate and environmental organizations last year to tell people in Congress that that whatever problems with China there are, and there are many, and they are legitimate, more military confrontation is not the answer to any of them. And it will make things worse on the climate front, and also probably on the pandemic front. And then finally, jobs. Now, some of you have probably seen some version of this before, if not many times before. But the simple fact is that relying on the Pentagon as a jobs creator is a bad public policy decision. It's not a good jobs creator. And what you can see here is how many more jobs could have been created for the same investment if we had taken money from the war and Pentagon, which is the blue, that's how many jobs are created from a $260 billion investment. And then those lines show how many more jobs could have been created in any of these sectors if you put the money into that instead of war. So for example, if you look at the one that is the highest and is hard to read is primary and secondary education. But if we put money into into primary and secondary education, into K through 12 public education, we could create far more jobs, more than twice as many jobs as we could by putting the same money into the military. And this is another great study from the Costs of War at Brown University, and from Heidi Peltier, the same person who wrote the inflation study. So it's just a bad economic decision. And that's kind of the most important point about the jobs factor. Now, finally, I'm gonna end on a little note of hope. So there is lots bad happening. There are lots of folks arguing for more money for the Pentagon, and lots of things that we're hearing about why that needs to happen. There are very bad prospects this year for a lower Pentagon budget. We've seen the House and the Senate add tens of billions of dollars to Biden's request. We've seen Biden's request be just as high as ever, higher than any of Trump's. And so we know we're in for a bad year for how much money this is going to be. But alongside that, there is an effort that is a piece of legislation called the People Over Pentagon Act. And this would cut $100 billion from the Pentagon to move it into human needs. And right now this has, I don't know the exact number of co-sponsors it has right now, but it's over 20, it may be at 30 by now. And in the House and growing every day. There are folks who are actively working on adding co-sponsors to get more members of Congress involved with this effort. But this is what we need. We need to build support in Congress for a smaller Pentagon budget. And we can't focus our efforts on, a 1% cut, or because the way it's growing, we need to take a big chunk off of it and give it to other things. And those other things need the money. So I have here a few examples of what $100 billion could pay for. And one of the examples, and we came up with this before the Inflation Reduction Act passed, so it was the clean energy and childcare provisions of the Build Back Better initiative that failed last year when Senator Manchin decided not to support it. And some of those clean energy provisions happened eventually as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, but none of the childcare happened. So none of that got funded. And there are so many things we could do with that money, and our communities need it. The economy is suffering, people are suffering. We haven't recovered from the pandemic at all, economically or socially or health-wise or any of those ways. So there are all of these different things that we could do with that money. And so besides just saying no to more money, this is something that we can organize around that's more powerful, and that would actually really start to turn back the tide of growing and ever growing Pentagon spending. So finally, just an example of a trade-off of what we could do if we shifted our funding. So we spent $8 trillion on the post 9/11 wars. But the cost of shifting our national energy grid to 100% renewable energy would have been just 4.5 trillion, just a little over half of what we spent on war. And we could have had a fully renewable energy grid by now. And that would, of course, help slow climate change, but it would also do other things. It would also mean things like when we see this terrible flooding or terrible storms or these power outages that last for days and days, a renewable energy grid would be more resilient to things like that. So you wouldn't have folks in Texas last year freezing in their homes because they didn't have electricity, because the electricity would have come back much faster. And you wouldn't have as many folks, without power in Puerto Rico for weeks on end, if you had a more resilient renewable energy grid. It's just, both the upgrading and the fact that it's renewable itself, all of that makes it more resilient. So we're losing so much by not funding that and by funding war instead. And then finally, I just want to point out that at our website, nationalpriorities.org, we have a calculator where you can find for your own state or your own city or your own congressional district, if you wanted to take part of the military budget or all of it, or the F-35 budget or any number of things, what could we pay for if we reinvested that money? And this is something that can be useful if you're writing a letter to the editor or visiting your member of Congress and want a talking point, and want to be able to say something about this is what we're missing out on by spending this money this way. This can be a really useful tool for that. So I'll stop there and happy to take any questions.
Wow. Thank you so much, Lindsay. That was a lot of really good information. And even as somebody who works in the field and is trying to keep track of things, it still is startling every time I get these trade-offs, and every year they get worse. The numbers get more and more startling. We have a lot of great questions in the chat as we move forward. If you'd like to ask a question yourself, you can indicate that by putting an asterisk in the chat. And I'm going to open by starting to read off a few of the questions. And there was one from Matt St. Onge that I thought was really great early on. So I'm going to just scroll up for a second. So Matt asked, when the US gives money, weapons, and training to Ukraine, does it come out of the existing Pentagon budget, or is that aid in addition to the Pentagon budget?
Yeah, that is a great question. Almost all of it so far has been addition to the Pentagon budget. So Congress has passed a series of several supplemental budget bills for military and non-military aid to Ukraine. But the answer is it's all additional. This will be the first time that potentially they may include some aid for Ukraine in the main budget bill. But this is the first time that would be happening. So far, everything that's been spent was additional.
So there's a question here from Michael Eisenshire. Is the sea-launched cruise missile different from the missiles carried on our nuclear submarines? And I also is the sea-launched cruise missile something that I have to add to that, the same as the super hypersonic glide vehicle? Is that referring to the same thing, or?
Those are different things. If you quiz me on the differences, I'm going to get in over my head pretty quickly.
All right. Well, I'm going to keep going with the chat, but if you have more questions, do feel free to put asterisks in, and hopefully we'll be able to get to some of the questions that are still there. So I'm going to go. We just asked one from Michael, and I know we had a few different folks ask questions here. So I'm looking for how many years have we been fighting the F-35, or when did that start?
Yeah, that's a good question. The program's been in development since the 90s. So it's been around a long time. It's been, I think, probably this community has been earnestly fighting it since, honestly, it's since before I was involved in this. So I think it's probably in the late aughts, early 2010s, though. Does anyone here want to correct me on that?
I know I was talking about it in 2009 when I started the New Hampshire Peace Action.
Yeah, I think it was probably a few years after the development started. I think maybe it was from the very beginning, though. I'm not sure.
I could throw.
I know. By the time we reached about 2010, it was clear that the program wasn't working out.
So going down, there's another question from Michael that I'd like to ask. What's the cost of maintaining 800 overseas bases? And I think that it's important to clarify, we don't know how many overseas bases the U.S. has, because that number is classified, and we know it's over 700 and probably close to 1,000, but I don't think anybody actually knows that number.
Yeah, we don't know the exact number. The best numbers that I've seen, both on number of installations and the cost, are from David Vine at American University, who wrote the book Base Nation, and is an expert on overseas bases. I think actually his most recent figure is that there are 750 installations, although I'm not sure why that has changed. And I think the other most recent figure that I've seen from him is that the cost is upward of at least upward of 50 billion a year to maintain the bases. But I think that's just keeping the bases. I don't think that's staffing the bases and running all the weapons systems and ships and things that are associated with those bases, but not part of them. I'd have to double check exactly what that includes, but I know that the Pentagon puts out an estimate showing how much they spend in each country that is far short of the total. It comes up with something like in the 20 something billion for all of its overseas activities, which is way short of where reality is. And they have no transparency about what they're including in those numbers. So, but I think the most trustworthy numbers that I've seen are from David Vine, and I can. He has a website for his overseas bases project that I can share in the chat.
Thanks, Lindsay. Next question from David Hartzow. Is there any support in Congress for the Poor People's Campaign demand of a 50% cut in the military budget? And do you think there's a way to gain or increase that support?
That's a great question. And I helped the Poor People's Campaign form their 50% cut demand. So I can say that the one ardent supporter in Congress is someone who won't surprise anyone here, which is Representative Barbara Lee from California. And she introduced actually the what's called the Third Reconstruction Act, which is something that was written with the Poor People's Campaign, in which we at the Institute for Policy Studies also helped with, that calls for a 50% Pentagon reduction. There are co-sponsors of that act. She has co-sponsors. I don't know exactly where that's up to right now. It's a relatively low number, but it's 20 or so co-sponsors for that act, which openly calls for what it calls for is an immediate 10% reduction and an eventual 50% reduction. So yes, there is some support in Congress. I think the way we build support for that is actually by starting with the more modest cuts, and that's where the People Over Pentagon Act and the $100 billion cut come in, which is a more modest cut, but it's still a something that if we were to ever win that, we should celebrate with all of our hearts and souls. So I think the path to building support for that is by starting with support for something somewhat more moderate first, and I think the People Over Pentagon Act is a really great vehicle for that.
All right. So a question from Doug Bogan that was responded to in the chat, but I'd like to hear your response. The question is, has the DoD ever completed a financial audit? And did they ever locate the trillions that they couldn't account for that were announced just before 9/11? And shouldn't they get their financial house in order before asking for a bigger budget?
This is a great question too. They have so many good questions. They did finally complete an audit. Actually, I think they've completed 2 now. They did not pass their audit either time. So for folks the backstory on this is that back in the 90s, there was a law, the Congress passed a law saying that major federal agencies had to pass an annual audit. It took the Pentagon more than 25 years to actually even complete an audit, let alone pass it. And they just kept failing to complete an audit. They couldn't even do the audit over and over again for years. And then in the last couple of years, they have finally completed some, but they have failed both, meaning that they were able to do all the activities of an audit, but they weren't able to actually come up with numbers that accounted for where the money went. They weren't able to actually, their books didn't match, basically. So that's the state of the Pentagon audit right now. There are repeat efforts in Congress by some members of Congress to say that the Pentagon can't have more money until they pass an audit, or to say that every year they fail to pass an audit, they'll get a nick on their budget. None of those things have ever passed, but it is another avenue that folks use to try to sort of nick away at the Pentagon budget. I would say I think that's not someplace where we've put in much of our effort, because even if the Pentagon can pass an audit, we still don't like where the money's going. So that's a bigger issue.
So a question from Brad Wolf, who's out in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He's the Peace Action chapter out there. He's wondering, would it be more productive to try to pass laws eliminating the revolving door between the Pentagon, Congress, and weapons manufacturers, which has been so effective in increasing the military budget?
Yeah, it's another really important avenue, and there are groups that are working very actively on that. One is Project on Government Oversight. They work in that area very much, and actually just had one of their staffers went and is now the military, they call it defense, staffer for Senator Warren. So that's promising. I think that is an important avenue. I also think that even if there, and there are some efforts to make the revolving door revolve a little slower that have been successful. Cooling off periods and things like that. But I think, for one thing, closing the revolving door on the Pentagon alone, it probably isn't possible, and closing it in Congress more generally. I think things that can pass now are more along the lines of cooling off periods. So it doesn't solve the problem completely. And even if you could close the revolving door completely, I think you'd still, for all of the reasons, for all the fear mongering that we have and the over-reliance on the military and the belief that American greatness comes from having this big military presence, I think it would be an important part of the puzzle. We work closely. We work together with groups like the Project on Government Oversight and support those efforts when we can.
Thanks. So Matt St. Onge asked another question here, and it's, what percentage of Democrats essentially think like Republicans in terms of the military budget? And I just want to, from a New Hampshire standpoint, that it's not about thinking like a Republican. It's about the reality that all four of our representatives who are Democrats, they see it as part of their job to go bring home jobs, and those jobs in New Hampshire are Pentagon spending jobs. They're Pentagon contracts. So I if you can talk a little bit about respond directly to Matt's question, but also how does that dynamic of bringing home jobs being part of what, in particular, Democratic parties, because I feel like a lot of us are kind of railing at the Democrats, asking them to be better, and not finding it. So how do you see jobs affecting the party politics, and and how many champions do we really have on these issues?
Yeah, it's a huge issue. The jobs issue is a huge issue. You do see people like Representative Mark Pocan, who is one of the sponsors, the main two sponsors with Barbara Lee of the People Over Pentagon Act, has a significant number of Pentagon jobs in his district. And he sticks his neck out on this. He is unusual in that respect. So it's a huge problem. I would say, for Democrats, that is one of the biggest, Democrats in Congress, that is, we're talking about, that is one of the biggest issues with getting their support on this. But it's still kind of neck and neck with wanting to not look soft on defense, I think. I think that's still also a big issue that Democrats in Congress are kind of faced with and are thinking about. One thing that we can do is we can show them, we have lots of polling that shows that the majority of people, especially the majority of Democrats, support cutting Pentagon spending to spend it on other things domestically. So that's an important thing. They need to know that. They need to know that the majority of their constituents probably would rather see that money spent in a different way. The other thing we need to do is, and there are various efforts that I know about, and have been a part of, and I'm continuing to be a part of, is that we need to recognize the real problem, which is, that folks in Congress don't want to see people in their districts losing jobs. And so what we need to do is we need to make sure that there are replacements for those jobs. They need to be ready replacements. They need to be immediate replacements. And we need to make sure that that problem is solved. That is something that has been really hard to do. It has been my hope and the hope of some other people that something like the Inflation Reduction Act that creates jobs through something like clean energy, or the Infrastructure Investment Act would have been a chance for this, where we have another good jobs creating bill, and we want to cut these jobs at the same time and move people over. That has not worked out that way with these opportunities, but I think that's the kind of opportunity that we need to be on the lookout for. That's the only way that I see that we'd have a shot at getting around this problem. But the other thing is, is that we can get some people who, like Representative Pocan, who are just that dedicated to this, that he's willing to, to take that risk and willing to make a stand on that. So I think those are some of the issues. It's a really tough. It's one of the most difficult things about this work is getting people to get around the jobs issue, as you know, Will.
Yeah, absolutely. As we've gone through, there were a few things. A number of people asked if there was a way to get these slides, and if you email those to me, Lindsay, I'd be happy to send them out to everybody who is here, who we've got on our list, and we could also potentially post that on our website if you wanted to. Also, this presentation will be shareable on the New Hampshire Peace Action YouTube channel. So if you've got folks you want to send it to, you can send the presentation out. There's another, somebody mentioned how we talk about it, the difference between defense spending and Pentagon spending, and that those words, and I just wanted to underscore it. I think when we all go out and talk to people, using the words Pentagon spending instead of defense spending, people want the country defended and don't want to cut defense spending, but everybody knows that there's Pentagon waste, and cutting Pentagon waste is something that resonates in a bipartisan way. And so I just wanted to underscore, I think that was Michael again who brought that up somewhere in the chat. So David Hartsow asks, is there any proposed legislation to support peace conversion to jobs for renewable energy, et cetera? Is there anything like that you know of?
It's a great question. I don't know of any specific legislation introduced that pairs those things. I'm trying to think back over the last couple of years and whether we've had anything that exactly did that. But I think what we've had instead have been things like the People Over Pentagon Act. The last 2 years for 2 years in a row, we had amendments that would have cut the Pentagon by 10% and spent it on domestic investments, but it wasn't specific to clean energy. So no, I don't know that we've put it exactly that way before. I think one difficulty with that is that the way that this is a little bit of a sort of a finer point, but because of the way Congress works, there wouldn't be a committee that had jurisdiction over that. So it's difficult because it splits between different things. So it's a little difficult to get somebody to get it moving. But I think it's also just, I think the folks like Barbara Lee and Mark Pocan, who have introduced legislation about cutting the Pentagon and spending on something else, have calculated that there is actually more support in Congress to be found if it's not just limited to spending on renewable energy or other climate programs. I think that's the main reason why that hasn't been the focus.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, so I want to give you a couple minutes for any parting thoughts or pieces of advice. Most of us are grassroots activists around New England. I know I've seen a lot of names of folks from Maine, and got Brad in Pennsylvania. So any parting thoughts for us on how to do our work more effectively?
Yeah, the thought I have in what we've been trying to do at National Priorities Project over the last few years is to really work much more closely with folks in other movements. So we've been getting closer with climate organizers. We've been getting closer with immigrant rights groups, have been terrific allies for us. They really, from a sort of anti-violence perspective, anti-militarization perspective, they really understand and are already committed to the causes of anti-militarism and anti-violence, and have been great allies. And folks who aren't necessarily here tonight, but if we can go to where they are and support their work and have them support our work, I think that's a way that we can make our movement stronger. And that's been a major focus of our work at the National Priorities Project for the last few years.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. That was so much information, and I know that I'm going to use a bunch of it in our work here at NHPA. Stay in touch with us, nhpeaceaction.org. There's also a link to the Priorities Project, National Priorities Project, in the chat, so check things out there. We'll be back every other Monday talking with somebody about peace or a peace adjacent topic. This series is going to remain free and open to the public. However, if you are able to contribute at this time, you can check us out at nhpeaceaction.org/donate. And I know National Priorities Project is also donor funded, so check their website out too. And thank you everybody for being with us tonight. And I'm going to go ahead and